Thank you very much for joining us today for Lecture 6 of the Language and Identity Workshop Series. Before we give a word to our main speaker, Professor IMAI Mutsumi, who is the head of Mutsumi IMAI Lab and Professor of Cognitive Development and Psychology at Keio University, I would like to say a couple of words about the flow of today's event. And my name is Maria Tilegina. I'm a project assistant professor here at Tokyo College and one of the organizers of the Language and Identity series. In this series, we discussed interaction, connection, and relationship between language and identity from various perspectives. So today's lecture by Professor IMAI is on the relation between language, culture, and thought. First, Professor IMAI will give the lecture. Then we will have time for questions and discussion. So, dear viewers, please find the Q&A button in the middle of your Zoom panel over here. If you have questions for Professor IMAI, please write them in the Q&A section. We accept questions both in English and in Japanese. And you can add questions at any time during the event. Also, please find interpretation tab in the menu if needed. Please note that recording this event is prohibited. And now to the main parts of today's event. Professor IMAI, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, this is Mutsumi IMAI, and then thank you for being here, and then thank you for the invitation, Maria-san, for this lecture series. I'm pretty excited to share my research with you. So, given the time constraint, let me just start. Let me just share the. Hi, so today I am going to talk about the relation between language, culture, and then thought. So let me begin. I will ask you, what is language for? Many people say that language is for communication, but there is another important role of language. The world is continuous and then contains vastly rich and complex information. Language reduces such rich and complex information, which is too much for human information processing, so that we can handle it within our memory and then information processing limitations. One important role that language does is language categorizes the world. Here, I quote an important word from Benjamin D. Wolfe, which after his name, there is an important hypothesis, the Wolffian hypothesis, or the linguistic relativity hypothesis. The Wolfe said, we cut nature up, organize it into concepts, and ascribe significances as we do, largely because we are parties to an agreement to organize it in this way. And an agreement that holds throughout our speech community and then is codified in the patterns of our language. Here, what does it mean? Let me show you, let me present the case for color. So color, we see color, various colors, but there is no clear boundaries in the colors, in the boundaries. But when we talk about colors, different languages segment color and label the section of the colors. For example, one example I show you, the top one is a language called Berimo, the Papua New Guinea language. And this language have 6 color terms. And Himba also have 6 color terms, but these 2 languages, the boundary of language, boundary of each color is different. Okay, so given that the language diversity of language in how it segments the world, what is the relation between language and sort? Here, I present the hypothesis which I briefly mentioned, the linguistic relativity hypothesis, or the Wolffian hypothesis, named after Benjamin Lee Wolf. So in one word, this hypothesis asks if it's sort shaped by language. And then here's again the quotation from Wolf. So he said, we dissect nature along lines laid down by our native language. And the world is presented according to him, the world is presented in a kaleidoscopic flux of impressions, which has to be organized by our own minds. And then this means largely by the linguistic systems in our mind. So usually, Wolffian hypothesis is interpreted to mean that language shapes thought, or the thought is determined by language. But important questions arise from the Wolffian hypothesis. So granted that the way language categorizes the world it's very diverse, do humans really see the world as kaleidoscopic flux of impressions? Does language really codify the world in language in totally arbitrary ways with no structure? Or is there any common patterns with which different languages codify the world? And if so, what factors underlie such commonalities? We can think about a couple factors, like intuitively, we intuitively think that perception might influence it, or there might be universally shared concepts or culture. So in this talk, I will explore these questions. So I address the relationship between culture and language, asking, to what degree does culture affect linguistic categories? And then to what degree does culture affect construal of similarity beyond language? Before we going into the main part of the talk, I should mention that the definition of language and culture, two most important terms in this talk, might be different across different field or academic field. In cognitive psychology, I am a cognitive psychologist, and then we are mostly interested in the influence of lexical or grammatical categories on perception, categorization, and then knowledge representation. But academians standing on cultural psychology, who are a subdomain of social psychology, treats language as a collection of narratives. So their notion of language is more meta level or more abstract level than cognitive psychologists do. And then they treat language as a collection of narratives that reflect culture-specific value systems and then epistemologies. And then they often discuss language at the level of discourse. Here, again, there are different scopes and an interest in culture. So anthropologists and cognitive psychologists are more interested in looking at or talking about subsistence, traditional values, and the mythologies in culture. But when cultural psychologists discuss culture, they are more interested in interpersonal relations. And they largely divide the style of discourse. One is interdependent social style, and the other, the opposite side, is independent social style. So, so when I say culture in this talk, I mostly stand on the anthropologist and anthropologist and cognitive psychology background. But sometimes in the last part of the talk, I use the definition of cultural psychologist view, right? So please keep that in mind, and keep that in mind, that the term language and culture may be different across different disciplines, academic disciplines. Okay, so let me start with some evidence for linguistic relativity. Okay, so let me start with intuitive one, very intuitive one, because I don't have time to deep into fine experimental procedure. Okay, so so what you see is this color, orangish color in a traffic sign. Okay, and here I see this. As a Japanese, I see this color is orange, but in this color is codified or labeled yellow in German, and Dutch, codifies as orange. Okay, and there is work that this label influences people's perception and memory. So when this color is embedded in the traffic signal, German speakers' memory of the color is shifted toward more typical yellow than really is. However, this color is presented in a different object by itself or in a different object such as a sock. Their memory of this color was more accurate. And then this phenomenon has been observed in a very classic study in the memory of visual images. So in this classic study done more than 19 years ago, these visual images were presented with different labels, two different labels. For example, this shape or this image was labeled either as a crescent or the letter C. Okay, and the participants saw each image with one of the two labels and were asked to draw the pictures of the images they had seen as accurately as possible. Okay, and I replicated this experiment with students in my class, okay? And these are the images, the pictures that they drew. When they saw this image with the title letter C, what they drew was really like C. But when they see the original image with the label crescent, then what they draw was really look like crescent, okay? So in evaluating the linguistic relativity hypothesis, we should consider not only to what degree is thought shaped by language, but also to what extent are linguistic categories shared across different languages of the world, despite this, their apparent diversity. If yes, we should consider what factors underlie such commonalities. Okay, so let us first see the role of perception. Okay, so let me ask whether is it perception or culture that contributes more strongly for universality and diversity of language. So to consider this question, let me use the case of walking. Walk, the verb walk is a very everyday kind of basic verb, right? However, when we use the verb walk, we construe very diverse locomotive actions as the same. Although each action of walking event can differ widely, they may differ in the agent, the manner of motion, speed, background, etc., etc. But when and then at the same time, we treat a learning action different from walking action, even when the same agent did the action through the same background. Okay, so walking and then learning action is kind of, continuous and could be very similar, done by the same agent and same background. But we somehow divide the action into two categories of walking and running. And some languages or many languages make finer distinctions within walking and then learning. So we are interested in how several languages, including English, Spanish, Dutch, and then Japanese, 4 languages codify the locomotion of walking and learning. And these 4 languages differ in how finely they divide the continuum of locomotion. But what we are interested in was to see whether there are any constraints, common patterns in naming locomotion. So to examine this question, we presented a series of videos on a treadmill. So speakers of English, Dutch, Spanish, and then Japanese watched a series of videos depicting locomotion on a treadmill. Here, speed and then inclination, the slope of the treadmill, were systematically manipulated. Participants were asked to label the locomotion at each video in their native language. The graph on the top shows how speakers of Japanese applied two verbs aruku and hashiru in English to each motion. Here you can see that there is a clear boundary between aruku and hashiru. And so it really doesn't, the shift from aruku to hashiru doesn't occur continuously, but the change occurs at one point, really clearly, okay? And our interest was whether speakers of other languages, Spanish, English, and Dutch, agree on this boundary point. Okay, so what we found was speakers of all 4 languages agreed on the transition point from walking to running. English, Spanish, and then Dutch speakers changed from one verb to another at the same point that Japanese speakers shifted from aruku to hashiru. So there appeared to be these results seem to show that there appeared to be a salient perceptual gap along the continuously changing motion, locomotion, and all or probably most languages would respond to this gap in their linguistic categories. So contrast to what Wolf said, the language doesn't just codify a kaleidoscopic, continuous, confused images, but there seems to be where the people, humans, are picking up some structure in the language, in the codification of language. But the question is, can we observe this pattern in other semantic domains as well? Are there always such clear structure in our codification of objects or actions? And let us now look at the domain of carrying motions. Here, we see a various, action of carrying or examples of carrying. And English name all these actions as carrying or holding. The distinction between carrying and hold is whether the agent is walking or moving or not, right? But so along this dimension, moving or non-walking, English chooses 2 verbs, but English are kind of, ignore, or they don't care about particular manner of holding motion, okay? But in Chinese, as you see, Chinese assign different verbs to each of these actions. Okay, so that means that Chinese divides these videos by different, very finely. Chinese has more than 20 verbs in carrying domain. What about Japanese? Japanese make finer distinctions than English, but not as fine. They don't distinguish these actions as finely as Japanese. They are somewhat in the middle ground. Okay, so what do we explain the cross-linguistic difference across different languages, particularly English, Japanese, and then Chinese? And then can we explain this from culture? As far as I know, we do not know whether cultural reasons contributed the way this semantic domain was lexicalized in English in the 3 languages. So the case of walking and running seems to be very structured, but this strong structure in how different languages lexicalize the domain does not hold for all conceptual domains. So the conclusion so far is that in certain conceptual domains, perception strongly constrains the structure of lexical categories, but in many or most conceptual domains, perception constrains lexical categories only weakly, if at all. So there is much sort of, arbitrary culture-specific decisions or selections in how the language codifies the world. But now let's see, when I consider how culture in general, culture come to play in the lexicalization of a language. Okay, so when a given culture, so influence of culture, is there any influence of culture on lexical systems? And when a given culture values a particular domain, its language tends to have an elaborate lexical system. So we can, think about many examples. For example, the Chinese language makes very fine distinctions for kinship terms. Native American languages tend to have sophisticated lists of vocabularies about trees. Jahai and Manik, languages from the Indonesian native language, have an extensive lexicon of olfacture, odor, right? So there are particular conceptual domains that culture wants to distinguish. But so far, it is not so clear what aspects of culture constrain the formation of elaborate lexical systems. Is it subsistence, traditional values of the culture, or beliefs embedded in mythology? For example, Mazet and Crosby examined whether the exceptionally superior ability to categorize and enable olfaction in Jahai and Manik should be attributed to ecology, subsistence, or language. And then they reported that only hunter-gathering cultures, the language of hunter-gathering, showed superior olfactory language and their performance and memory, just as Jahai and Manik people do. And then the Jahai and Manik people are also hunter-gathering. So subsistence, how they make living, seems to be related to the lexicalization patterns. But it is so far not clear whether this finding applies to other conceptual domains. Now, let us now see the influence of culture in a different perspective, or the perspective from cultural psychology. So as I said, cultural psychologists are interested in how a communication or discourse style affects people's performance or thought. Okay, and then they broadly divide the communication styles into two categories: interdependent social style culture and independent social style culture. The former, interdependent social culture style, is less agent-oriented and then specifying the agent of the sentence and blurring the boundary between speakers and then listeners. In contrast, independent social style culture, people are more agent-oriented and they tend to clearly identify who did what. And the interdependent, and then these cultural psychologists characterize agents or East agents as have interdependent social style, and the Westerners has the independent social style. Okay, so now, we have considered language as well cultural factors in two different perspectives. Now we now want to see, as a cognitive psychologist, I wanted to see if there are hierarchy for which factors influence the people's notion of similarity. Okay, so we now explore the role of language and culture on the construal of similarity between objects in the world. For I understand that this series, for this series, identity is the keyword, right? But for the notion of identity, the sense of sameness and then similarity provides foundation. So, so we first want to see whether noun labels influence or affect the notion of similarity, people's construal of similarity. And intuitively, yes. And there is interesting study that establishes this. So in this study, done by Masuda and then colleagues, English and then Japanese speakers were asked to rate the similarity between a pair of objects. And the images objects that are, there are images of objects that correspond to two distinct linguistic categories in English. So for example, being and P, you know, the English treat B and P, being and P as two different categories, right? But in Japanese, we put together, you know, collapse the two categories into one, and then we just say mame. So in both language groups, objects belonging to one linguistic category in their own language were perceived as more similar than those belonging to separate categories. So just by this cute, simple experiment, you know, we could see the influence of nouns or lexical categories on the construal of similarity. Now, I would like to see shift to the case of noun classification systems. Okay, the majority of world languages have a grammatical system which categorizes nouns. The three major grammatical systems are numeral classifier system, count mass grammar system, and then gender grammar system. These grammatical systems are interesting as they categorize nominal concepts at the meta level. These systems, in a way, show what aspects the language values in organizing the concepts or the world. This can be examined at two different levels. Now, so in this study, in the study that I'm start talking about from here, we looked at numeral classifier system. In Japanese, we call it josushi. And numeral classifier system are found in many, not only in Japanese or Asian languages, but found in many languages across unrelated language families from geographically very diverse regions. And used the numeral classifiers are used when given noun appears with a numeral or number, and classify nouns into grammatical categories of mostly over hundreds. There are many classifier systems, and so that's the difference between the count noun grammatical system, which classifies nouns only into two categories, countable things and uncountable things. Unlike count mass grammar, numeral classifiers divide nouns into many often more than 100 classifiers. Okay, and here, so when we count long thin objects like bats or ball pen, we use hon in Japanese. And flat things, we use mai. And for things like liquid with a container, we use hai. Okay, so the classifier systems consist of large number of semantically formed grammatical categories, as I said, and the semantic features. So it's interesting. What are the semantic features that underlie these systems, and whether there are any common patterns across languages? The answer is yes. The semantic features underlie the system are very consistent. So across languages from very different language families and regions, they tend to incorporate animacy, size, shape, dimensionality, functionality, and rigidity. And so these are the most important semantic systems across languages in classifier categories. So this universally common pattern indicates that there are certain conceptual features in the world that are salient or important to humans, regardless of geographical environment or culture, and that these features are codified in the grammatical classification of nouns. So from the language side, we can say that. So from the cognitive psychology side, overarching question is, does the classifier system affect similarity between objects? Does language, the way language codify or categorize nouns at the meta level, affect similarity between objects? Here, let me tell you that in the literature of concepts and categories, it has been noted that there are two major relations that organize our concept. One is, of course, taxonomic relations, such as cats and dog or apple and bananas. So they are two distinct lexical categories, but they are both animals or fruits, right? So these taxonomic categories are very important for organizing our concepts. But recently, researchers proposed that semantic relations are also important and integral part of our conceptual structures for even for educated adults. And so semantic relations are like, so things that belong to the same thing or things that are used for the same goal, okay? So for the camping scene, lantern and tent are, we often see both. So we can say that these two, a lantern and a tent or a sleeping bag, have semantic relations. Okay, so there are taxonomic relations and then semantic relations. And our question is whether this language-specific grammatical relation, like classifier relations, influence concepts or play an important role in organizing the concept of classifier speakers. So we asked, how do the same classifier relations interact with taxonomic and semantic relations? Speakers of classifier languages and speakers of non-classifier languages think differently, or view similarity, construe similarity different. So to examine this, in our experiments, we just tested the hypothesis on a similarity judgment task. We designed the stimuli such that we can directly compare 4 types of relations along the same target object. One object was taxonomically related to the target, and the second is semantically related to the target, and the third was from the same classifier category as the target object. And then we had a control object, which has no relation, which bear no relation to the target object. So here is a table showing the structure of the stimuli. 14 sets of quadruplets were constructed. Around the same target, 4 objects were chosen such that each of them represent one of the four relations. For example, tree was paired with the target object flower to present a taxonomic relation. Base was chosen as an item having a semantic relation with flower. The object used for the semantic for the same classified relation was cloud. So we tested with it with Chinese speakers, and in Chinese, cloud and flower belong to the same classifier category. And then this object, the object for the control was shoe, which had no relation. And on top of examining the relative importance of the 3 relations, conceptual relations, taxonomic, semantic, and then classifier relations, we can throw an additional interest from a cultural psychology theory. We could ask, are Chinese people more sensitive to semantic relations? This standing from the proposal by Nisbet, a famous social or cultural psychologist. And then the Nisbet and colleagues argue that our cognition and conceptual structure are much influenced by cultural specific traditions and values or discourse style. And as I say, what is most relevant here is the style of interactions, interrelations or interaction styles with other people. And Nisbet and colleagues argue that East Asians organize their concepts around semantic relations, while Westerners organize their concepts around taxonomic relations. So our study thus provides an excellent opportunity to test for this theory of cultural psychology. Okay, so here is what we did. We had Chinese undergraduate and German undergraduate living in Beijing or Berlin. And we presented words, 2 pairs of words, and then instructed people that please rate the similarity of the 2 objects on a 1 to 7 scale. Okay, and given the point of interest were that was whether Chinese and German speakers show different preference pattern for the 4 types of object pairs in the 3 in our task. Okay, or whether do Chinese speakers show higher ratings for the same classifier pairs than Japanese speakers, and whether Chinese speakers show higher ratings for the Semitic pairs than German speakers. If the second question, the second pattern bears out, this could be taken as evidence for linguistic relativity. But if the third pattern is observed, that could be taken as evidence for the culture-specific cognitive bias, or the theory from cultural psychology. Okay, so this is the result. As we see, so the similarity ratings from 1 to 6, the max was 7, the 1 to 6 was presented in a bar graphs. Okay, so in two cultures, Chinese and in German, it's clear that the preference agreed. They agreed on the preference was the relative reliance of conceptual relations. So in both cultures or both language groups, they saw the pair of objects bearing taxonomic relations are most similar. And then the second comes the object from the same semantic relations. And then the classifier relations, and then control. And so the reliance of, or the preference reliance of conceptual relations in their judgment similarity agreed for the two cultures or two languages. Okay, and so it's interesting that even Germans, Germans rated the classifier relations more similar to the control object, the pairs. So there is some sort of underlying similarity in classifier categories, and then Germans or speakers of non-native language could pick that up. So here, the second graph shows the difference score from the control, okay? So in both cultures, the difference between taxonomic relation and then control were very large, and then there was no difference between the two culture groups. Semantic, but when we look at semantic relations, there was a difference as consistent with the cultural psychology view. Semantic relations were rated more similar than by Chinese speakers than by German speakers. So we see some weak evidence for the cultural psychology view, the discourse, the view that the interaction style, culture-specific interaction style affects the notion of similarity, okay? And interestingly, when we look at the classifier relations, yes, Chinese speakers rated the object from the same classifier the same classifier category more similar than German speakers. So here, to summarize, we see both universality and cultural specific patterns. For universalities, for both language groups, taxonomic and semantic relations are two major organizers over concepts. And the order of the reliance of relations agreed on both cultures, okay? And another interesting point was that German speakers were able to detect the commonality underlying Japanese classifier as well. So they could detect subtle perceptual cues underlying a Chinese classifier system. But there is also influence of culture-specific attention to the world. such that we saw that Chinese speakers showed stronger reliance on semantic relations than Germans in similarity judgment. And fourth, we also saw a specific influence of classifiers on the construct of similarity in Chinese speakers. But the classifier effect in Chinese speakers need to be qualified because German speakers were also sensitive to the similarities. Okay, so we could see a hierarchy of similarity, such that there are similarity or the relation between two objects that can be detected by all speakers of language or all cultures, in all cultures, regardless. Okay, and then there were such similarities, like the most appealing or most obvious similarities are identity, right? If two objects are drawn from the same kind, we can always see them very similar or the identical. And then we can see the similarity between two objects from the same kind, like two cats. And then we can also see that the similarity of two objects, but at the superordinate level, like mouse and then dog. And then we can also see the similarity between semantic relations, as long as the culture recognizes the semantic relations. For example, I'm not sure if different people from different culture see that incense and Buddhism altar are semantically related. Okay, and then there is some very cultural or language specific relations codified by classifier like dog and river. So there seems to be a hierarchy along which people access similarity and identity. Okay, so to sum up, in this talk, I explored how the notion of similarity is related to language and culture from the perspective of cognitive psychology. And I conclude that language is diverse, but yet it's constrained by universally shared perceptual and conceptual factors for some domains. And there seem to be natural node points in the world, which invite humans to form universally common categories. But culture affects formation of linguistic categories in some degree, such that culturally valued concepts are labeled more elaborately than those that are not. But it is not so clear whether cultural values affect construct of similarity without involving language. And for that matter, it is not clear whether humans have such things as culture without language. So the last word is that complexity of the relation between language, culture, and thought defies simplified conclusions. So now I stop my talk. Thank you for listening.
Dear Professor Mai, thank you. Thank you very much for your amazing talk. We probably have time for maybe one question. So could you also please have a look at the Q&A? We have a question from Victoria Ejbajabo, I'm sorry. And it says, thank you very much for your inspiring lecture. As you exemplified it on several examples, one of the most important factors is the abstractive relevance as differentiatia specifica of the concept of science, as Buchler stated. for the codification of boundaries and picking out relevant boundaries. You presented very good examples. My question is, how do you treat changes as walk and run could have new boundaries through new jogging and walking habits? As for the German yellow, it would be interesting to see the bigger cultural frame, like national connections through national flag in the German case, and in the Dutch case, House of Orange.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand your questions. So you wanted to know whether could you say it again, that the walking and running boundary?
So you could have a
can I see the question in text?
Yeah, if you press Q&A in your menu, they show up.
Okay.
It's the very first question in the open questions.
Great.
So I think the main question here is, are there any changes in language of walking and running due to new habits of people?
New habits, like in the sense of Whorfian hypothesis.
Yes.
I'm not sure. It's probably not so much. So I presented this. I gave this example as more within language habits. So it's an example of language or words. The use of word changes memory, or probably perception and memory within a language. And I don't know if Dutch speakers and then German speak. I'm sorry. So German speakers, or I'm sorry, that for the speakers of 4 languages like Spanish, English, Japanese, if there are conceptual boundaries of learning and walking, it's different. Well, the boundary between walking and running is really very main one. And then they agree, like 4 languages agree. So there is no difference. And then within Dutch, for example, Dutch makes much finer examples. And so probably Victoria wanted to know whether the fine distinction makes their perception, makes the attention or invites the attention to make fine discrimination. And we didn't do such data. We do not have data to show that, but given from other studies, I think it's likely. It's very subtle, and then not, but in color, in the domain of color, for example, there are languages that distinguish very fine. So distinguish 2 kinds of blue. For example, in Japanese, we distinguish ao and mizuiro, right? And then in such case, I think to some extent, when we see 2 colors within the same lexical boundary, we tend to see them more similar than when they go across the lexical boundary. So for both the walking, running cases and color cases, that's possible, but at a very fine level. Sometimes at the level of brain, actually, there is an interesting study that shows that brain respond whether the 2 colors are within the lexical boundary or across the lexical boundary. The brain respond differently, even though the words are not presented.
Okay. Thank you very much. There was also a comment from Joy Henry about the color. That yellow is called amber in UK English. Yeah, so there is also a difference there. I'm sorry, we won't be able to answer all other questions, but I think Stephanie could ask the question again in the next part, because we have a next part. Everyone, please find the link to the next part in the chat. We will have 4 presentations of early career researchers and a discussion with Professor IMAI. And I am really grateful to you, Professor IMAI, for your amazing talk. And thank you very much to our lovely audience. And to Tokyo College for giving us an opportunity to have this kind of discussion. And thanks a lot to our interpreters and my colleagues who helped with this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then can I possibly have these questions later when I close the Zoom room?
Yes, I think it is possible. We could send it to you.
Okay.
The questions will be sent to Professor.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm sorry that I couldn't finish the talk earlier so that we have more time for discussions.
Yes, thank you very much. And now we will finish
to
this part of the
symposium. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.